Let's talk about foods. Anybody ever know anyone who had gotten hooked on a food? Everybody has. Here's the important thing. A lot of times people will think, you don't know me. I've got a problem with sugar. Or I've got a problem with chocolate. Or I've got a problem with something else. Two things. First of all, everybody's got problems with food. Number two, it is not you. There is nothing wrong with you. There's something about certain foods that just call our fragile brain like a moth to a flame, and that's just the way they are. It's not you, it's the food, okay? All right, so now let me just focus on the question that is on everyone's mind, which is how to magnetize a baby. You start with the baby. The baby should be 9 to 12 weeks of age, and you sit face to face 15 inches apart. You take 1 teaspoon of sugar, stir it into a cup of water, and plunk the baby's pacifier in the sugar water, and then stick it in the baby's mouth. Set a timer for 3.5 minutes and maintain eye contact the whole time. When the timer goes off, stop. The baby is now magnetized, and you may leave the room. Come back in 15 minutes later with a dozen other people, and what you discover is that the baby looks at nobody except you. And the baby will coo and gurgle and throw a seductive shoulder, and the baby loves you. And by the way, this doesn't have to be your baby. This could be anybody's baby. Grandparents have been doing the same trick for a long period of time. Here's what happens. Sugar on the tongue triggers the release of opiate chemicals in the brain. In turn, they trigger, like the next domino to fall, the release of dopamine, which is the pleasure chemical. And this was being released in the baby's brain while at you. So you are what makes all pleasure arrive. Now, we are not babies. Oh, by the way, you can do this on the first day of life. You know how a baby sometimes has a little heel stick to draw a blood sample or something like that? They cry less. Or I'm not recommending circumcision necessarily, but if one gives the kid sugar water beforehand, they cry less. Except if mom happened to be a heroin addict, in which case the sugar doesn't affect the child. Any ideas why that would be? Because the baby's been bathing in opiates for 9 months, and the brain's now relatively resistant to it. But the point is, sugar triggers the release of opiates in the brain. It's a drug, and it works on day 1. Now, we are not babies, and we're not interested in sugar water. We have our own forms of sugar, and we have our own reactions to it. And so this raises then the question of, is sugar a problem? And I am going to say, in theory, it is not a problem. Sugar, if I have a teaspoon of it, 15 calories, who cares? The problem is that sugar dissolves. And so I can dissolve it into cookie batter, or I can dissolve it into a soda, a lot of it. And suddenly you've got a whole lot of calories mounting up, or I can put it into Twizzlers or other things that may well be totally plant-based. But I can pack a whole lot of sugar in. And when I was a kid growing up in Fargo, we had sodas at birthdays every 2, 3, 4 months. And they were in bottles that are now in museums. They were 6 ounces. And then I remember when cans came in, my mother would say, oh, they're so big. I wish they'd make a stopper so I could save some for later. And then it was 16-ounce bottles, and then the smallest bottle of soda you're going to see at the 7-Eleven now is 20 ounces. And the kids are not saving some for later in the week. That all goes down the hatch. And, of course, I don't want to addict them just with sugar. I'm going to put in a little caffeine so that an 8-year-old kid can become a caffeine addict from Dr. Pepper, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, or whatever. And so you're giving them 250 calories in every one of those 20-ounce sodas that they don't need. Now, the other thing, you remember the Trojan horse? The Greeks, in mythology, devised this Trojan horse to hide in, and they planted it outside of Troy, and then they seemed to go away, and at night the Trojans said, look at that, that's cool, let's bring that in. And then once inside the walls, the doors opened up, and the Greek soldiers sneaked out. Well, sugar is a Trojan horse. Here's what I mean. The sugar lures you in to a cookie or a cake. And then all the butter and the shortening that's hiding in that cake will expand your waistline. Here's what I mean. I'm going to allrecipes.com. I'm looking at chocolate chip cookies, and I find this nice recipe. And here's what's in it. Cup of butter, cup of sugar, cup of brown sugar, 2 eggs, some other things. And now there is sugar in there. And a lot of people will say, well, it's the sugar that's making me so heavy. But there's also some butter in there, quite a lot. And if I look at the calories, 25 grams of sugar has 100 calories. 15.6 grams of fat has 140 calories. In other words, in that cookie, you are getting sugar calories. But all the butter and grease that's brought into it contributes a whole lot more calories than the sugar did. Sugar lures you in, the fat fattens you up. Okay, America's favorite vegan cookie, Oreos. It's got sugar, it's got flour, it's got palm or coconut oil, it's got a lot of other things in it. And let's look at it. There's the sugar. There's more sugar and high fructose corn syrup, and there's some fat. And if I have 2 cookies, 13 grams of sugar, that contributes 52 calories. But the 7 grams of fat contributes 63 calories. So you get the idea. I'm not suggesting that sugar is health food, but one of the worst things it does is it lures you into all kinds of other mischief. Okay. But it's not just sugar, right? Are there some other foods that we can get hooked on? Anything here? Cauliflower? No? Strawberries? No, it's not. What is it? Chocolate? Anybody here ever have a thing for chocolate? No? Everybody does. What's it about? Okay. In the emergency room, we use something called Narcan or naloxone, and it's used to block the effect of narcotics. So a guy shoots up on the street. He's shooting up heroin, and he does not realize that his new batch is twice as potent as his previous batch. He shoots up the same amount, and in a couple of minutes he gets wobbly, and he falls face down in the gutter, limp as a rag. And his friends know exactly what is happening, which is he is about to die. And they grab his limp body, and they bring him into the emergency room, and what we do is we rip off his sleeve, crack open this bottle of Narcan, and we inject it into his bloodstream. And the Narcan goes to the brain, and it attaches to all the opiate receptors and kicks heroin off. And he wakes up. Right away, you've saved his life. You can give that very same drug to a chocolate addict. Now, I don't mean a person who appreciates a little fine Belgian chocolate. I'm talking about a person who is really binging on chocolate. And you give them naloxone, and then you give them a tray of chocolates. And you say, have some. They'll take a bite, and they'll set it down. And you say, go ahead, have some chocolate. I've got a lot more. Not really in the mood for some reason. No, go ahead. And what you discover is that you've knocked out a lot of the reason that they were eating chocolate. They thought it was all taste and mouthfeel. But the truth is that chocolate triggers opiate release in the brain too. And I can prove it with Narcan. But by the way, this is not a treatment. This is a research tool. It's a research tool to help us differentiate what is caused by a brain effect versus just a taste that you like. I could use it as a treatment, but I'd have to go with you to the 7-Eleven and inject it IV on your way in. So anyhow, you get the idea. And chocolate is not just sugar. If a person wants chocolate, they are not going to be satisfied with a box of Domino sugar and a spoon. They want chocolate. And chocolate has sugar in it, but it has a little bit of caffeine and a lot more theobromine. Now, any of you have dogs? Did your vet ever tell you not to let your dog eat chocolate? Here's what the vet is. The vet is thinking about theobromine. In humans, it's a mild stimulant that makes us like chocolate. It's very potent in dogs and can even be fatal. Chocolate also has phenylethylamine, which is a little bit of an upper, and it prevents the breakdown of anandamide, which is another brain-modifying compound. So chocolate isn't a drug. It's the whole darn drug store in one food, and then, of course, we add sugar and vanilla and other things to it. Now, anybody ever have an issue with cheese? When we work in research studies introducing people to a plant-based diet, what I find is very often the food they have the most trouble breaking up with is not steak. It's not fried chicken. It's not shrimp. It's cheese. And I think, what the heck's that about? It smells like old socks. Why are people getting hooked on this stuff? But they do. You know what I'm talking about? So the reason is partly it's salty, partly it's greasy, it's very oily, and people like salty, oily things like onion rings and potato chips. But there is also something called casomorphins. Now, there's actually morphine itself in milk, not a lot, just traces that are made by the cow's liver, but I don't think that's really the issue. I think the issue is what are called casomorphins. Casein is the milk protein, and casein-derived morphine-like compounds are found in milk. And as the milk protein is digested, they break out. They go in the bloodstream to the very same receptors that heroin attaches to, and they give you just a little bit of feel-good. Here's the chemical structure. This will not be on the test. The most potent is morphoceptin down there. That has about 1/10 the brain binding power compared to pure pharmacy-grade morphine. So it's not enough to get you arrested, but it's just enough to make you think, that cheese is really nice. I hope we have some in the fridge. By the way, is that an issue? I'm going to say yes. First of all, if you look at the calories and just the fat content of all the common cheeses, it's a lot. And if you look at cholesterol, it's as bad as steak. So when people think, well, I got away from meat, I'll still dig into the cheese, they're really hurting themselves in a bad way. And by the way, dairy products also contribute to rheumatoid arthritis, to migraines, to digestive problems, to asthma. If you know anybody who has these issues, if they will just, as a test, get away from dairy products, not all of them will get better, but a surprising number will. And they don't have to take it on faith. They can just test it for themselves. And then they can bring the dairy back in later and bring it in and out and in and out, and pretty soon you'll be convinced about what it's doing. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. Why would we get hooked on, or if we're getting hooked on, why would nature build into milk an opiate? And I'm going to suggest that I think it is part of the mother-infant bond. Think of it this way. If a calf didn't like nursing, or if a human baby turned away from the breast, have you ever looked at a breastfeeding baby? They have such a look of intensity. And then when they're done, they collapse into sleep. They're comatose. And you think, what a beautiful thing, this mother-infant bond. I got to tell you, you just drugged the kid. Mother Nature doesn't like leaving anything to chance. So to nourish that baby, there's protein and there's some sugar and some fats and a few other things in milk. But nature puts in a little bit of feel-good, so the calf won't wander too far into the woods and will come back for the drug. And this baby's the same way. It also has effects on mother, by the way. In some rather rare cases, casomorphins from a mother's own breast milk have leaked into her bloodstream. And if she gets a huge load that hits the brain, she can have mental status changes, including frank psychosis. And there's a big theory that postpartum psychosis is actually caused by casomorphins in her own breast milk reaching the brain. Isn't that interesting? So one of the worst things about milk, though, just fact to know and tell your friends who haven't yet broken up with dairy, is prostate cancer. Along the right is a higher milk consumption, how much people consume day after day. And way over on the right, you see Iceland and Sweden and Switzerland and Finland. And the higher up you go, that's prostate cancer. And what you can see is a pretty good relationship, that the countries that consume the most milk have the most prostate cancer. So researchers in the United States said, is that true here? They rounded up about 21,000 physicians at Harvard University. They tracked them over a number of years, and those who consumed the most dairy had a 34% increased risk of developing prostate cancer. Well, that was suggestive, so they did the study again with a brand new group of people, almost 48,000 people, and they're all health professionals, and same thing. Those who had the most milk servings in a day had, in this case, a 60% increased risk of prostate cancer. So there are reasons why we believe that's the case. We'll come back to this. The U.S. government is well aware of the addicting power of cheese and wants to take advantage of it. And I want to show you a few slides that I actually got from the U.S. government through the Freedom of Information Act. In the year 2000, the dairy industry, working with the government, held something called the Cheese Forum. And these are not my slides. These are U.S. government slides. They wanted to figure out who are the people that we can drive into cheese addiction. And there are some people they called enhancers. An enhancer is a person who just sprinkles a little bit of cheese on their salad. Or they enhance their pizza with just a little bit. They're not interested in you. The people they want are the cravers. These are people who have the cheese in the fridge. They just open the door, crack it off, and the block, and stick it in their mouth. That group of people can be encouraged to double or triple their cheese intake. And so they want to go after them. Well, how are we going to do that? We want to trigger cheese craving. Again, these are not my slides. Don't get paranoid. This is just the way the government works. What they decided not to do was to just put some ads on TV saying, why don't you eat cheese? It tastes so great. What they did is much smarter than that. How do I reach into every community in America at the same time? The way I do it is I contract with fast food chains. So the first one was Wendy's, and they worked with Wendy's to develop the Cheddar Lovers Bacon Cheeseburger. This was a U.S. government program. And during the promotional period, they sold 2.25 million pounds of cheese and a lot of fat and a lot of pure cholesterol. So they then worked with Subway, which had some sandwiches where cheese wasn't an ingredient, and they fixed that. They worked with Pizza Hut to put an entire pound of cheese on one serving. They worked with Burger King and Taco Bell so that you're going through the Taco Bell drive-thru, and they would say, welcome to Taco Bell. Would you like to try a quesadilla today? And this was all done on contract where the government paid the fast food chains. I can show you the contracts to promote cheese. And I have to tell you, it worked. I don't know if you could see this, but this was the last slide of the Cheese Forum. These are spiders who have woven a web at the bottom of a kid's playground slide. If we pull this off, we'll eat like kings. Well, they did pull it off. Americans are eating more cheese and more cheese and more cheese every single year, and we're seeing obesity go right along with it. All right. In all of my books, I've talked about health. But when I wrote The Cheese Trap, I have to say my eyes were opened to a new part of this, which had to do with her. And if you don't mind, I want to just talk about where cheese comes from for a second. It comes from a cow, and cows have to be pregnant. I know this sounds surprising. Cows don't give milk. I mean, they don't give milk in any case. People take it. But they're not producing milk until they have become pregnant and have given birth. So in order to have your dairy run efficiently, you keep the cows pregnant every single year. They're impregnated every year, and this is not done with roses and chocolate and Barry Manilow records. This is done by artificial insemination. And so the United Nations shows dairy farmers how to do it, and I want to show you some United Nations diagrams on how this is to be accomplished. And they do these in diagrams so that people from all different countries and low literacy areas can do it. What you do to impregnate your cow to make sure that she will make milk for you is you take a glove and you put it on your left hand, and it goes all the way up to your shoulder, and then you insert your left hand into her rectum all the way up to your elbow about, and through the rectal wall you can feel the uterus. You hold it steady with your left hand, and with your right hand you take what looks like a knitting needle and shove it through her cervix, and you inject semen that you took from a bull. Now, these animals are not volunteers, but they are not going to object because she is chained by the neck and is not going to fight. And this is the way it actually looks in reality. And then once it's done, you write a date on her side, and she's going to give birth 9 months later. The gestation is about the same as for a human. And 9 months later, she's going to give birth. And despite the fact that she did not ask to become pregnant, her baby is now born. And the baby is there on the ground in hay and looking up at mom and blinking his eyes and trying to stand up in this really awkward way. And the mother looks down at her baby and starts to clean the baby. And the farmhands all gather around and they say, it just gets me every time. Because you can see this bond developing between a mother and her newborn. And then pretty soon they realize, this is a dairy. If the baby drinks the milk, then what are we going to sell? And so they have an implement that solves this problem. It's called a wheelbarrow. You pick the calf up by the chest and put the calf in the wheelbarrow, and then you walk out of the room. Now, there is no bond in nature stronger than a mother and her child. And she follows. And she's basically saying, excuse me, this is my newborn baby. What are you doing? And she will fight and until you go through a gate and slam the door, and she sees her baby go off, and she'll never see the baby again. And she will stand there and not move and cry out. And the baby is now put in a hutch like that. If he's a male, he'll be killed shortly for veal because they like that rubbery muscles. If this is a female, she will develop horns, so the horns are cut out by dehorning or disbudding. They're just scraped out of the skull, typically without anesthesia or without significant anesthesia. And then, about a few years later, or every year, the mother gets impregnated, and her babies are always taken away. But when she's about 4, the farmer, who is always a good business person, says, "How much do I have to feed you to get milk out of you? You're not producing as much milk as you did when you were 2. And so the farmer says, "How about if I send you in that truck to the slaughterhouse and replace you with your daughter?" And that's exactly what happens. By about age 4, a cow lives 20 years normally in nature if they have the chance. But on dairies, they live to about 4, at which point they're slaughtered. So let me share with you a quote that I found as I was writing the cheese trap. "Strange noises coming from High Road near Sunshine Dairy Farm Monday night and into yesterday morning prompted local police to alert residents that there's nothing spooky or scary going on. According to Newberry Police Sergeant Patty Fisher, the noises are coming from mother cows who are lamenting the separation from their calves. It happens every year at the same time." So this is not just in industrialized areas. This is all over the United States, all over Canada, all over North America, all over the world, including places like India that purport to respect animals. India is the biggest beef exporter in the world. They're not eating the beef. They are producing the dairy, and then somebody else kills the water buffaloes and slaughters them. In the United States, 200,000 dairy cows are slaughtered every month and for their meat. So the dairy industry is a meat industry. But before you get slaughtered, you are impregnated and separated from your offspring for about 4 years, then they kill you. So I know these facts are rather creepy, but the reason that I wanted to share them is that if you're looking for another reason to say maybe cheese is not such a great idea, if this helps us to look at these products a little bit differently, then it's useful for us to know. So can I eat something instead? Can I? Of course. There's all kinds of things we can have instead. When I was a kid, it was all grilled cheese. I never heard of this thing called hummus. What is that? There's plenty of things to put on a sandwich that are not cheese. And you can go into the health food store, and they've got that pizza, and right next to it, they have that one that doesn't have any cheese at all. And I can make my own vegan pizza with my secret ingredient, nutritional yeast. Anybody use nutritional yeast? You know, it smells like cheese, doesn't have any fat in it. Anybody ever make tofu ricotta? You could fool your friends. They will swear to you, this is the real thing. No, it's made with tofu. It works fine. And, of course, there are all kinds of other things that can take the place of cheese. It's really easy to avoid it. Okay, we talked about sugar. We talked about chocolate. We talked about cheese. What about meat? For a lot of guys, they will say, "I would rather die than give up my grill." And they seem to mean it. So researchers back in 2000 did this interesting survey. They said to a group of people, "Would you give up meat for a week if I pay you $1,000? And what was surprising in the survey was who said no. And among Asian Americans, almost nobody said no. They said, "Give me the $1,000. I can, I can make tofu. There's a lot of things I can eat." And the same was true for Hispanic Americans. Almost nobody would turn that deal down because I know about beans and rice and tortillas. Easy for me to not eat meat for 7 days. Give me the money. But among white Americans and black Americans, the idea of not having meat for a week was so loathsome that about a quarter of them had said, $1,000 is not enough money for me to go 7 days without meat. That's starting to sound like addiction, isn't it? So let's bring Hank into our laboratory. Let's roll up his sleeve. Let's inject Narcan into him. And what you discover is that his desire for ham or salami or tuna drops, showing that, yes, there is a taste and there are nutritional things, but part of it is a brain effect, a narcotic effect from the meat. Okay, is it a good idea to get away from meat? I don't need to tell this group. You can reverse heart disease. Your average person loses about 10% of body weight, but what that means is if you're already at a healthy weight, you don't lose anything. And if you have a lot of extra weight, you lose a lot. Cancer risk drops by about 40%. Blood pressure comes down. You've seen the new literature on Alzheimer's disease. It's very, very exciting to see what we can do by making this kind of change. Now, some people will say, wait a minute, what if I just switch from beef to chicken? beef, leanest beef, about 29% fat, leanest chicken, 23. Fish varies, some lower, some higher. Chinook salmon is 52% fat. You're really not getting to a healthy diet by just making these modest changes. Okay, I mentioned dopamine a couple of times, the brain pleasure chemical. Let me just come back to this a little bit. Dopamine is made by your brain. Nature made cells to give you a little pleasure. And what nature had in mind was if you find a food that will sustain your existence, I'll give you just a little dopamine to make you feel good and to remember the food you found. And if you procreate, if you have sex, you get a little dopamine as well because that preserves the species. This is an awkward system, but this is what nature did. And what you see here on the top, that's one cell, and on the bottom is another cell. The little black dots are dopamine. And they're in little vesicles, and they go down to the bottom, and then those little black dots come out, and they go from one cell to the next. And when they get to that other cell, there are receptors there. Those little things that look like the dopamine attaches to them, and that gives you that feel-good that makes you want to do this again. So if the little black dots of dopamine come down and they find a receptor to attach to, then you get that feeling. However, it turns out that there is a gene. It's called the DRD2, dopamine receptor D2, TAC1 allele. If you're born with this gene, you don't have as many receptors. You've got about 1/3 fewer receptors than everybody else. So you get some dopamine release, but there's no receptors for it to attach to, and you go through life not feeling so great. Everybody else is happy, you're not. You got a little black cloud over your head. Until you're 15 years old and you smoke your first cigarette. And you get a little dopamine, a little extra dopamine. You discover, I'm feeling a little better. Or you have a drink, or you take drugs, or you go to Las Vegas and you gamble. You discover that your involvement in all these things is stronger than other people. And you are making up for a dopamine deficiency. Do you understand what I'm talking about? So many people are born with this. Between 12 and 40% of people, I call them A1+, they've got that gene. They've got fewer dopamine receptors. They are at risk for smoking, alcohol abuse, compulsive gambling, and compulsive overeating. In our research studies, we have found that people who are born with that gene have more trouble following healthy diets compared to other people. But before you say to yourself, wait a minute, that's got to be me, the prescription is the same. We treat food like a drug. What I mean is we don't moralize. It's not a moral issue. It's a biological issue. And so if food is like a drug, I need to do things that help me break up with drugs. You need a lot of social support. It's good to be strict rather than trying to moderate it. It's better to just build a fence and say, this drug doesn't love me too much. I'm just going to not have it anymore. There are certain tricks we use in breaking drug addictions, and we use exactly the same thing for food addictions. Now, when we do this, we discover that our fellow caregivers and our patients sometimes have certain rationalizations, such as, my grandfather smoked, drank, and ate all the wrong things and lived to be 90. Yes, but he was alone. Nobody else did that. There are some people who manage to do okay, but they're really not very many. Diet advice is always changing. Just eat what you want. You'll hear people say that. I have to say that diet advice is very much coalescing around a plant-based diet. The body of evidence now in 2018 is so strong that a plant-based diet is the way to go. There's really not much debate about it anymore. My favorite one, I'm blood type O, so I have to eat meat. Do you know that one? How many of you are blood type O? Like, it's the biggest blood type. This is from a well-meaning but ill-informed book called Eat Right for Your Type. And the idea was if you're blood type A, you should be vegetarian, but if you're type O, you need a little bit of meat. The thing that's goofy about it, though, is when people come into our lab and we put them all on the type A vegetarian diet, even if they're type O, they do better. So I've got a new book coming out. It's called Eat Right for Your Shoe Size. If you're a 9.5, I'd use a vegan diet if I were you. If you're a 10, vegan. If you're 11D, I'd do vegan. You got to die of something. Many people will say, I just want to enjoy life. You got to die of something. That's true. But many people start dying when they're 30. What I mean is we're gaining weight. We're feeling out of sorts. We're stopping doing the things that kept us alive. And then we're on medications that take they give us side effects. And our life is being taken away from us bit by bit by bit. Our body is descending bit by bit, and we finally die. What I'd rather do is be as healthy as I possibly can, and then maybe when I'm 105, I'll die in the Monaco Grand Prix in a flaming inferno. My car hits the wall, he's dead. Okay, you want to be functional as long as you're alive. All right, healthy eating is expensive. You heard that. True, if you happen to go to a health food store and insist that they hand roll sushi for you every day. But on the other hand, if you go into the regular grocery store and you get a bag of rice and beans and a bag of sweet potatoes, these are the cheapest foods that there are. You're going to save money on a healthy, simple, plant-based diet. Healthy eating is time-consuming? Maybe, maybe not. There are quick foods, there are frozen foods, there are canned foods, there are foods that you can prepare yourself. You're in charge of how much time you want to invest in it. The stress of denying yourself is worse than that of giving in, I have to say. No. I can exercise those calories off. Ooh, this is the biggest disappointment of people at the gym. Have you ever been there? You can get on the treadmill and punch that little button that shows how many calories you're burning, and then start running. Run a mile, and then see how you did. A mile burns off about 100 calories. Run 2 miles. Okay, 200 calories. And now go look in the vending machine at how many calories there are in a Dr. Pepper. There's 250 calories in that one soda. So you can exercise it off, but you won't have time to do anything else. It's much easier to not bring it in. All foods can fit everything in moderation. We hear dietitians say this a lot. There are no bad foods. There are only bad diets. It's a corollary. Let me tell you something. There are a lot of foods for which the word bad fits really perfectly. And the idea of having everything fit in moderation. The word moderation is totally abused. Moderation applies to good things. Let's say my daughter likes playing the violin. She's 7 years old. She loves it. And after about 4 or 5 hours, you say, maybe you should eat something. Maybe you should study. No, Dad, violin all the time. Or I only want to read great literature. Well, at some point, you should exercise. You should get some sleep. Moderation relates to good things. But if your daughter comes in the room and says, I'd like to do just 1 line of cocaine, or I'd like to smoke a cigarette, or could you make me a gin gimlet? No, we're not going to have moderation in bad things. It applies to good things. So this idea that we should have moderation in all things was designed by the Bad Foods Council that wants you to include everything in your diet. So, okay. All right. There are lots of foods that I think deserve the term bad, and here are some of them. And they are everywhere, and I don't care if you have a will of steel. These foods will call your names. And caregivers, I'm talking about doctors and nurses, have their rationalizations too. We have to follow people's tastes, or we have to stick to people's cultures. I think it's a big mistake. People will say, okay, you're from an African-American family. You grew up in Alabama. So I'm not going to talk to you about pesto. I'm not going to talk to you about hummus because that's not your culture. Wait a minute. How presumptuous is that? I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, and we didn't have an Italian restaurant in town. We didn't have a Chinese restaurant in town. We didn't have anything. And if you're telling me that I've got to stick to what's normal in Fargo, that's my decision. Your job as a caregiver is to tell people the truth and let them explore the foods that are available to them and let them choose what culture they want to follow, and don't you prejudge them. So. Also, we hear people say we need more research before we can say anything. I think that was true in the 1920s. I think that is no longer true today. We have more than enough evidence that we can tackle the major killers of American adults, and we need to use it. I do hear a lot of doctors sometimes say, my patients would rather pop a pill. There's some truth to people wanting a convenient response, something that will give them a response very conveniently. But I have to say, the patients who come into Barnard Medical Center, every single one of them would say, if I could get off all these medicines by changing my diet, sign me up. That is what I want to do. Patients do not want the expense and the side effects and the incomplete benefit of taking medications if they can find a better way. And caregivers need themselves to learn how this really works. So how do we do this? I have a few rules that I use with everybody when they've got a food craving issue. And the first is I like to encourage people to start with a healthy breakfast. Now, everyone is different. Everyone has their own way of thinking about it. I find that if a person goes to work hungry, the donut tray that goes by looks more appealing than if they'd had a healthy breakfast. Secondly, it's often good to choose foods that hold your blood sugar steady. What I'm talking about is if you have sugary foods or white bread, your blood sugar goes up and then it comes down, and when it's coming down, cravings kick in. But if your blood sugar roller coaster is evened out a little bit with foods like beans, certain root vegetables like sweet potatoes that really keep your blood sugar steady, the cravings aren't quite so intense. For dieters, I try to encourage people not to cut calories. But if someone insists on calorie counting, I use the rule of 10, which is I say, okay, I want you to take your ideal body weight, multiply it by 10. So let's say I should weigh 150 pounds. Times 10 is 1,500. Don't ever go below that. I don't care how much starvation you want to inflict on yourself. If you go below that number, you're going to have cravings, and you're going to have binges afterwards, okay? But hopefully you don't need this rule, because hopefully you're not counting calories. If you're on a craving cycle, what this means is every day at the same time, chocolate calls your name. You'll see these cycles, and you'll get into them. The idea is to do something inconsistent with eating at that time. So if your refrigerator is magnetic at 8:30 at night every single night, don't be home. That's the time to be with somebody doing a walk or whatever it is that gets you away from that cycle. Have regular exercise and regular rest. This is important. If you are not well rested, you were up all last night, how is your resolve today? It's shot. You'll do anything just to get through the day. You're not going to eat well. Your self-control is terrible. If you had a really good night's rest, the donut tray doesn't look quite as appealing. How do you get there? Well, it's really good to be physically active so that you're tired, so that you sleep better. Kids run around all day, they're physically active, and then at night they lie down, they're comatose. And they wake up the next day feeling really pretty good. What do adults do? They don't move very much, they read, they turn off the TV, and then they put their head on the pillow hoping that they're going to go to sleep, and they don't do so hot. If we're physically active during the day, including exercises that strain the muscles a little bit, like push-ups and things, then the body demands sleep, and the next day you'll have a little bit better resilience. Social support is really important. Social support is what drug programs use, and if I stick you in a brain scanning device, I will show you that when people are with other folks, they actually get a little bit of squirt of dopamine too. So when people are around other people and they're talking and they're interacting, their brain helps repel addictions a little bit. And take advantage of other motivators. When I was showing you the calf, or if you're an environmentalist, there are lots of reasons why we decide, I want to eat in a healthier way. I want to do this for my kids. Whatever it is, if we're thinking beyond ourselves, we often do better. So these are the healthy foods, the fruits, the grains, the legumes, and the vegetables. And if I got just 3 more minutes, there's one other concept that I just want to share with you a little bit. It's called universal meals. And we're working on this now, but I want to kind of try this on for size with you, if you don't mind. Here's the idea. If you go into just about any restaurant nowadays, our populations, almost anywhere you go, are more diverse than they have ever been. I'm talking about people from all different countries, all different races, people with linguistic differences. And this is true whether you're on a plane or you're in the airplane club or you're in a school. You see people from all over the place. And they often have their own food needs. There might be a vegetarian who doesn't eat meat or a vegan who doesn't eat animal products at all. There could be many people of color avoid lactose, the dairy sugar, because it will cause digestive upset. A lot of people are going gluten-free these days. There are people who have allergies, like peanut allergies. If you were raised in an observant Jewish family, you're going to avoid pork and shellfish, and your life is easier if the dairy is not part of it. If you were raised Muslim, pork is out, alcohol is out. If you were raised Hindu, you don't want meat, you don't want eggs. And Ethiopian Orthodox tradition uses vegan diets 2 days every week and throughout Lent. So, wouldn't it be easy if you didn't have to go through things like this? I'm at a restaurant, I'm sorry, all the soups have dairy. Or I'm on a plane, you wanted a vegetarian meal, you should have called. Well, how about this? What if we have meals that work for everybody? What would those be? All right, I'm on this plane now. There's a person who's Hindu. I'm going to get rid of the beef. That's gone. And let's see now. I want to get rid of that pork too for my Muslim friends. And if you're also Jewish, we're going to get rid of the pork and the shellfish. And somebody's got a peanut allergy. There's peanuts. Let's get rid of that. Some people have a gluten sensitivity. That's gone. And if a person is vegan, they're going to get rid of dairy and eggs and the fish and even the honey. That's gone. What does that leave? That leaves vegetables. It leaves fruits. It leaves legumes, meaning the bean group, and non-gluten grains. So can I make a meal out of that? Well, I don't know. What would that look like? Well, I could make a nice lentil soup. Here are my glass noodles, Asian style. Here's my sweet potato hash. There's my arancini, which is like a risotto ball. And this is the way I made it in my restaurant. And now United Airlines said, I want your recipe. And there it is on the airline. How about that? That's kind of cool. And now, here's my dessert, my blueberry cobbler. And I can even give you a vegan dessert if I want to. And then when you say, do you have any non-dairy creamer? The answer is, sure, of course we have it, because nobody objects to that. And suddenly everybody's happy. You're on your airplane, and would you like the vegan chili? It's a universal meal. It's very popular. And suddenly, instead of people screaming at the flight attendants and at the waiters at the restaurant, suddenly everybody's happy because every menu has their universal meals somewhere on the menu. Is this a good idea? So what we're doing now is we're just trying this out to see what recipes would work and what wouldn't work. I have to tell you, the hardest thing is gluten-free, because there's so many things that people want to have where gluten is an issue. But we're including that too, and we're working with food developers, and we're really having fun with it. So let me thank all of you for being part of this. And my hope is that if we look at these, what I'm going to call food addictions, and realize it's not you, it's the food, and it's not just you, it's everybody. We can tackle these together, and if we can put some policies into place, I really think we can change the world. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Dr. Barnard, thank you. Would you mind answering 2 questions that were submitted on? Okay.
You bet.
Thank you. I'll read them. One of them, in your talk today, you mentioned eating breakfast as a means to help, like, avoid the donut box at work. A lot of people in the Ultimate Weight Loss Program, or in general now, are doing something called intermittent fasting. Do you think somebody that suffers from food addiction should eat breakfast even if they're not hungry, or do you think it's better to wait until they're hungry to eat?
You know, I think you'll find, I personally like to encourage people to explore and find what really does work for them, because I think there are many people for whom that works really, really, really well. So, yeah, why not? Have at it and see how you do.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned cheese, chocolate, sugar, and meat in your book, Breaking the Food Seduction. Many of the people in this room also have a problem with other substances that aren't named in your book. They may not be addictive in the same neurochemical way, but a lot of people here have a problem with flour. If they eat pasta, even whole grain pasta, or bread without the oil, they get triggered, they overeat. And a lot of people have problems with nuts. And my question is, so many people listen to other authorities that say, if we don't eat nuts, we're going to drop dead. That we must have nuts with our salad to absorb the micronutrients. I mean, can you be a healthy vegan, a healthy person, and not include nuts and seeds? Or is this a holy grail?
Yeah, no, of course you can. Absolutely. And nuts have some benefits, but they're not necessary by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, when we are working with people with weight issues or diabetes particularly, we take the nuts out, and the avocados too, just because as delicious as they are, they have a lot of fat and calories packed into them. If a person is eating nuts, what I strongly encourage them to do is not go to the 7-Eleven and get some pack of salted roasted nuts and then eat them like a whole food group. Instead, what you do is you put the nuts in your hand, crumble them up, and just use them as an ingredient or an enhancer on your salad or something like that, not as a major food group. And for a lot of people, we leave them out completely. And yes, you'll be perfectly happy. Will you absorb the fat, soluble vitamins? Absolutely. There's plenty of, even broccoli and spinach and beans have those traces of fat that will help you absorb the fat, soluble vitamins. You will be fine.
Thank you, Dr. Barnard. Let's hear it
Thank
for
you.
this rock star. Woo-hoo!